started for the sake of you who are right on time. And I want to introduce myself and our distinguished guest today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Charlene Margot, and I'm the founder and director of the Parent Education Series. We are starting our 15th year. So although we miss seeing all of you in person, we're delighted to be offering this new parent education webinar series coming to you today from my home in Menlo Park. And we're very excited to have with us Dr. Mark Reinecke from Child Mind Institute. So a couple of things before we get started. I just want to let you know that this recording will be available by video along with the Q&A on our YouTube and Vimeo channels. Those are available on our webpage at seq.org, Parent Resources and Parent Education Series. I hope that, oh, there it is. Okay, it looks like most of you are able to log in. So, and also we have coming up another webinar on Thursday, this Thursday, April 30th, with Dr. Aaron Vogel. The event is Vaporized, Navigating Teenage Trends in Vaping, E-Cigarettes, and Social Media. Really excited for that. Dr. Vogel is a postdoctoral fellow and social psychologist at the Stanford Prevention Resource Center. All right, let's get started. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our guest presenter today. Again, Mark Reinecke, PhD, is the clinical director of the Child Mind Institute, San Francisco Bay Area. He is Professor Emeritus of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and past chief of the Division of Psychology at Northwestern University's Feinberg School of Medicine. He also served for 14 years as the director of the Center for Cognitive Therapy in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neuroscience at the University of Chicago. Again, we are going to have about 30 minutes with Dr. Reinecke, and then we'll open the floor for questions from you all. And if you're new to Zoom, the question tab is at the bottom of your screen. It's a Zoom icon labeled Q&A. All right, let's take it away. Mark, thank you so much.
Well, good afternoon and good morning. Thank you very much for having me. It's very nice to be here and to join you today. And thank you all for coming and joining us. As mentioned, my name is Mark Reinecke, and what I wanted to do is share with you something that is close to my heart and perhaps on your mind too, which is managing anxiety and stress. And so first, a bit of introduction. Lisa, next slide. This is who we are. I work with Child Mind Institute. It's a clinical research institute new here in the Bay Area. And it's a child study center in essence. So we have three missions: the tripartite mission of clinical care, which is excellent, research, and what we call dissemination, which is we're not for profits. We give our product away. We give information away. We do research in open science. It's a great organization. I hope you get a chance to know us. Next slide. There we go. Research, clinical care, public education. Next slide. This is new, and I hope you'll take a look at it. If you go to our website, childmind.org/coronavirus, or just childmind.org, we have a broad range of resources for you and for families on how to manage the stresses and problems that come along with coronavirus, with the pandemic. And it's all for free. So take a look. It is, in a world where there's lots of websites and lots of places, this is a trusted resource. It's information that you can have confidence in. Next slide. So this is our outline for today. We're going to talk about coronavirus, the scope, its impact on children. And there's an unstated component to this, which is its effect on you and me. I want to talk about anxiety, stress, worry, but the principles that apply for children and teens are also the principles that apply for you and I. Next slide. So the notion is, there's the kids, and the kids are all worried and stressed out. Actually, if you take this slide, they're not sitting in a classroom anymore. That's both good and, as we all know, bad at the same time. But they are feeling the anxiety as well. Next slide. She's stressed, that's the teacher, and you know something, even with online school, the teachers are taking a brunt. It's really tough. Administrators as well. Next slide. He's stressed. Next slide. She's stressed. I was going to say that looks like my desk. I could show my camera around a little bit. I know that feeling. Next slide. The notion then is that we live in a worried world. And if I was to ask folks to raise their hand, who is not stressed, anxious, or worried right now? Nobody would. We're all feeling it. With children, we've always talked about how 1 in 5 has some sort of emotional or mental health issue or concern. Right now it's 5 and 5. Every youngster is feeling this nowadays, the pandemic. Next slide. What do we worry about? Well, this is the old list. We worry about terrorism. Next slide. And the deficit, and if you look at the right hand, this is a 2019 graph. Yikes, that red bar is actually probably twice as long right now. Next slide. We worry about retirement, and this, the stock market's dropping. It's really tough right now. So that's a concern for people. Next slide. We worry about global warming. Interesting that something could happen that takes global warming off the front page. Next slide. And that is this guy. It's not just leading the news, it is the news. And I think the long-term impact is going to be economically and socially, it's going to be felt for at least 3 to 5 years, perhaps longer. Next slide. What do we worry about? Well, you've seen this list. Scheduling for kids, bullying at school, college admissions, sick pets, water heaters breaking down, empty nest, my kid is leaving, and then it's even worse, boomerang, my kid is coming back. There's lots of things on parents' mind. Next slide. And these are the things that kids worry about. Too much homework. My teacher doesn't like me. How am I going to do on the SAT, the ACT? I don't look good. I got a bad haircut. My daughter, when she was a teenager, she'd say, the girl, she's such a poser. What if I don't make the team? What if I don't get into fill in the name of whatever is the preferred university? Kids have a lot on their mind. And I would say it's in some ways worse now. It is. We live in a tense world. Next slide. The notion then is that everybody gets their share of worry, anxiety, fear. Nobody gets away free. And that impacts your family. It affects my family. Next slide. Which brings us to this. This is a book I did back in 2008. You're free to take a look. You can probably get it on Amazon for about $4 now. But the notion was it was very similar to nowadays. I was the head of a department at Northwestern. And I came in one day and we took a 30% salary cut right across the board for everyone in the department because the endowment to the university was down. And of course, as you know, when you make a donation, they can't use the principal. They use the investment income off of it. So when the investments drop, your revenue drops. So I came home one night and my wife goes, so how was your day? And I said, well, it was really good, except for we all took a 30% salary cut. And she goes, oh my God, this is horrible. And I said, well, no, it's going to be all right. We're going to do this and that and this. And oh my God, it's horrible. And she goes, why aren't you anxious? And I said, well, because we're going to do this and that. And she goes, well, why aren't you anxious? And I said, I opened up my computer and it's actually a laptop sitting next to me right over there. And I had my 20 PowerPoint slides that were for the lecture I gave to the second year medical students on how to manage anxiety in your anxious patients. And my wife thumbs through them and she's looking through them and she goes, everything my mother taught me was wrong. And I said, I could tell you that, prepare for the worst and hope for the best. It doesn't work out so well. So she's looking at the slides and she goes, these slides would make a great book. And I said, I don't do popular books. I think the line I used was, I don't go Oprah. And she looks at them and she goes, you do now. So next slide, please. So this is the 20 PowerPoint slides. They became the 20 chapters of the book. And what I would like to do today is just step through some of them, not all of them, just a few of them to give you a sense of anxiety and how we can manage it. Next slide. Where do we want to go with children and adolescents? We need to get inside their head. We need to understand how they're thinking. Next slide. The first lesson in all of this is anxiety is normal, it's adaptive, and it works for us. It's based in the limbic system, the lowest area of the brain, right above the brainstem. From an evolutionary perspective, very old. It's an adaptive emotional state in that it facilitates a response to, and I like the word at the bottom, a perceived threat. We perceive something is coming at us that is dangerous, and we either need to flee or we need to protect ourselves from it. So this is, from an evolutionary perspective, a very adaptive and very old system for responding to a perceived threat. And it's worth noting, every animal above a nematode, everything above a little earthworm has a limbic system and has this at play. That's how old this system is. Next slide, please. The second lesson, anxiety has 4 components. We usually think about it as the phenomenal experience. I'm feeling anxious or worried, but it really has 4. The anxious mood, the experience of the affect, the physiological component, the tension, my pupils will expand so I can take in more light. Muscle tension, so I'm getting ready to flee, heart pounding. All of these are your body physiologically responding in a way to prepare to deal with the threat. Cognitive, the ways we think about things, the perceptions that we have, the memories that we have, are all focused in on whatever the anxiety-laden threat is. And then finally, behavior. We want to get away. We want to get out of Dodge. We want to avoid or escape the thing that is threatening to us. So the notion then is that anxiety, like any emotion, it has what they call control precedence. It organizes your perceptions, your memories, your actions. And the way I put it, when I say control precedence, it really does take control of your head. The way I put it is, it's very hard to think about what you want for dinner when you're about to be hit by a bus. All of your cognition, your perception, your behavior is directed to that bus that you see coming at you. And it can't be any other way. Okay, next slide. So what happens? What are the cognitive components? We become vigilant. We start scanning our world. We become very sensitive to threat cues. We tend to appraise things as threatening that may not be threatening. We tune up the sensitivity of our threat monitoring. We tend to overlook safety cues. As a colleague said, there's very little evolutionary value in smelling the pretty flowers on the side of the hill. We need to be scanning, looking for the saber-toothed tigers. We look for security or guarantees. We want to know whether it's going to be all right. I refer to this as the most difficult issue, in that, frankly, there are no guarantees. We know bad things are going to happen. We've had many pandemics before, and we'll have more in the future. These things happen. We've had recessions before, and we'll have more in the future. These things happen. So what I can guarantee you is that life has its turmoil. I can't guarantee you that you'll be healthy, or that your finances will be fine, or that your kid will get into a good college. What we have to do then is tolerate ambiguity and tolerate threat. The other thing that we get is threat-related imagery. These pictures and awful thoughts go through our head. Now, what's worth noting, and I put on the bottom there in red, the solution is embedded in the problem. What we want to do then is to dial back this vigilance, reduce the hypersensitivity to threat, pay attention to the safety cues, to the evidence that I'm going to be all right. Let go of that desire for a guarantee. Relax a bit, let the tension go, and let's distract ourselves and direct our thoughts away from this negative imagery. And by the way, don't be watching the news and the images of coronavirus and the death statistics. You know, they're on its saturation coverage. Don't do that. Turn it off. Next slide, please. These are the normal fears of childhood: separation from parents, little kids not being part of the group, snakes, and when I was a youngster, whatever was under the bed. These are normal. Every kid gets them. Next slide. And this is the normative teen anxiety, teen fear. This is from the New Yorker. We want you to have fun as long as it's fun that enhances your college admission application. Next slide, please. When it's severe, as these develop and become consolidated, they can become an anxiety disorder. And there's the list: separation anxiety, phobias, social anxiety, fear of rejection, selective mutism, GAD, generalized anxiety, panic tends to emerge a little later in adolescence. But the notion is these things can become consolidated and emerge as an illness, as a disorder. And what's really troubling is once they get established, probably 80% of the time, someone who has an anxiety disorder in adulthood, its onset is before they were 18 years of age. So when we see this in a youngster, we really want to treat it aggressively. We don't want this to become a lifelong pattern. Next slide. It's a common concern. Oh, this slide doesn't look too good. The lining is off. But as you can see, between 1 and around 20% of youngsters have some sort of anxiety disorder over the course of their childhood. It's 1 in 5. Next slide, please. Where does it come from? Well, a couple of things. For sure, genetics plays a role, and the environment plays a significant role. Temperament. There are some youngsters who are quite inhibited, quite shy, quite risk averse. And you see this in the preschool years, the ones who are really shy and risk averse, that projects forward into adulthood. And then cognition, the ways that we look at things. The notion then is each of these contributes. It's not one thing that causes anxiety, it's many things. Next slide, please. The heritability, it's in the family, it runs in the family. Well, not so much. The heritability index is about 30%, which means about 70% 60 to 70% of the variability is accounted for by environment. So for sure, genetics plays a role, about the same as having a heart attack or breast cancer, but it's not all of the variants. Next slide, please. And it is in the brain. I could go on for an afternoon about this slide, but the notion is there's a circuit in the brain that reverberates when we get anxious. And what it does is there's actually you can see on the side of the brain there, it's an inhibitory GABAergic fiber that tells the brain, okay, I've gotten the signal that there's a danger, I've taken action, and then the inhibitory message, the danger has passed, doesn't get through. And so what happens is the brain starts to cycle, regurgitating and thinking through this thought of threat. So there's two ways then to address it. One is what we call top-down, cognition, the frontal lobe thinking through the problem, and the other is bottom-up, by addressing the activation of the limbic system, the amygdala. And so you can use medication or different types of therapy. Not surprisingly, both tend to work, and what we tend to advocate is doing both. Next slide, please. Now, the notion then is that we learn to be anxious. We learn this in a couple of ways. One is from classical conditioning, and you all remember this. This was, for example, with the little kid who was, this is the study done at Hopkins by Watson, where he was playing with a rabbit and he came up behind him and banged a pot, and the child developed a phobia for rabbits that then generalized to any white fluffy thing. Classical conditioning works. It does, you can become anxious through classical conditioning. Operant conditioning, being rewarded by escape. So something bad happens and then I try to get away from it. That you'll feel an immediate reduction in anxiety, which rewards your fear. And then finally, vicarious or observational learning. As Hemingway said, you don't have to die to write a death scene. And the same thing applies here. We can become anxious by observing somebody in an awful situation, so that we will then want to avoid it. Okay. Now, the clinical tip embedded in this is we want to use all three approaches: classical conditioning and desensitization, operant conditioning and rewards, and then modeling to overcome anxiety. Next slide, please. This is perhaps, I don't know if we'll call him the father of American psychology, but certainly he's both a philosopher and a psychologist. And if you go to Harvard, the psychology department is in James Hall. So this is William James. And he said the first fact for us, and it was as psychologists, but the first fact for us is that some sort of thinking goes on. The first fact is that thought and cognition are important. That insight, which was around 1895, was lost on American psychology up until about 1955, 1960. He was literally at least a half a century ahead of his time. Next slide, please. The same sentiment, but years earlier. This is Milton. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell and a hell of heaven. Next slide. And William Shakespeare, this is Hamlet. There's nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. Next slide. So cognition is important. Well, what happens when we're anxious? Well, this is an equation that I like my students to memorize. It's a simple one. And you can use it too. Anytime you're fearful, afraid, worried, anxious, one of those emotions, it implies there's an impending threat. Something bad is coming your way, and that I can't cope with it. I can't handle this. So what we want to do then is, on the left side of the equation, we want to reduce the perception of threat. And then on the right side of the equation, we want to enhance your perception of your ability to cope. Now, what's worth noting is that what the fear is depends what's in the threat box. If you put spiders into the threat box, you get phobia. If you get social rejection in this threat box, you get social anxiety. If you put heart palpitations in the threat box, you get panic disorder. If you put tall buildings in the threat box or airplanes, you'll get a phobia. If you put everything in the threat box, you just drop it all in, you get generalized anxiety disorder. But the only thing that differs between them is what do we put in the threat box on the left side of the equation. So when you get anxious, just ask, the first question is, what's the threat? What's the danger I'm seeing coming at me? Next slide. So what happens then is we perceive this thing coming at us and we feel danger. There's a danger and vulnerability. I'm vulnerable. I can't handle it. Next slide. It's worth noting, and I mentioned this before, we like a guarantee. We want to know that things are going to be okay, but we can't. We can't have that. So, and the line is in the bottom, if you want to feel secure, you need to accept ambiguity, that the future is unpredictable. The phrase I use is we just leave it at that. We need to tolerate ambiguity, tolerate uncertainty, embrace it, because there is no alternative to that. There's a Buddhist, you can look it up on Google if you Google this phrase. There's a Buddhist monk, a picture of a Buddhist monk sitting in the middle of a pond, and it says, "Relax, nothing is under control." It's true, it's true. Next slide, please. So, coming to control. What happens when we're anxious is we have an increased estimate of the likelihood of something bad happening to us. After 9/11, they did a survey, and it turns out 80% of Americans thought that they or someone who they loved would be harmed or killed by a terrorist in the next year. You know what the actual number was? You know what the answer was? 0. When we see something bad, we overestimate the likelihood of it happening again. We overestimate how awful it is. And because we can predict it and think it's going to be coming, we overestimate our sense of responsibility for the act. I could have seen it coming, and so I should have prevented it. It doesn't always work that way, but these are cognitive shifts that we make when we see something anxiety-laden. Next slide, please. You all remember these guys. This is the Chilean miners. They were buried, hundreds of feet, a mile, I don't remember, a long, long way underground. And they survived they couldn't control their environment, but they could influence their experience. And by exerting what influence they had, they were able to maintain a sense of how would you put it, well-being in an admittedly dire situation. We want to look about your world and say, how can I influence the outcomes I want here? Next slide, please. And this is very important for teenagers. And I'll put it as a question to you. Perfectionism. For every problem, there's a best solution. I should strive for it. This is the kid who says an A- is the same as an F. Actually, no, it's not. An A- is the same as an A-. There's always room for improvement. And I should pursue perfection no matter what the cost. Expect the best, settle for nothing less. I think not. I say that I would argue, and I think there's good research on this, that perfectionism is a two-edged sword. It leads to us to build great things and do great things, but it comes at an enormous cost in terms of guilt, depression, and anxiety. Next slide. So here we have Martha Stewart, the icon of perfectionism. And what does she say? Well, I'm a maniacal perfectionist, and if I weren't, I wouldn't have this company. It's the best rap. Nobody's going to fault me for this. I have proven that being a perfectionist can be profitable and admirable when creating content across the board in television, books, newspapers, radio, videos. All of the content is impeccable. And the question I would have is that how we want to lead our lives? And is that what we want our children to be like? Typically not. Next slide. We don't want to be perfecting ourselves to death. Next slide. Now, this is one of those things that, how'd you put it, I wish I'd written. It's a lovely piece. And this is from Anna Quindlen. I believe it's from a college commencement. And what she says, and let's parse the words here carefully. Trying to be perfect may be sort of inevitable for people like us, like you and me, who want to do well and we want to be thought of well by others. We're smart, ambitious, and interested in the world and its good opinion. At one level, she says, it's too hard, but at another, it's too cheap and easy. It requires you mainly to read the zeitgeist of wherever and whenever you happen to be, and be the best at whatever the zeitgeist dictates or required. And when you're clever, you can read them and do the imitation required. And here's the line I wish I'd written. But nothing important or meaningful or beautiful or interesting or great ever came from imitation. The thing that is really hard and really amazing is giving up on being perfect and beginning the work of becoming yourself. Well said, well said. Next slide, please. So, perfection, we should dispatch the concept. Perfect solutions don't exist conceptually or in practice. It's associated, as noted, with both depression and anxiety. And when we don't meet this ideal standard, this expectation for ourselves, we tend to feel stressed and guilty. What I would argue, and this is the Reineke comment, is in a changing world, in today's environment with coronavirus, flexibility and creativity are more valuable than, and this is a dig at Lexus, more valued than the relentless pursuit of perfection. Let's be flexible, let's be creative, let's be tolerant. We'll get ahead that way. Next slide, please. Sometimes you can take control and sometimes you can't. It's true. Actually, there's a book called The Way of the Bodhisattva. It was written in the 8th century, and it says, for those things that I control, what is the need to worry? And for those things that I cannot control, what is the need to worry? And then the line, and what more else is there to be said? It's true. So this notion, I should have seen it coming. And if only I had fill in the blank, I'd be okay. Let's dispatch those concepts. Looking for responsibility over things that are out of our control is a fool's errand. So ask yourself, did I actually cause it? Probably not. Are there other factors that contributed? Probably there are. And whether this is coronavirus or a grade in school, there's probably many factors that contribute. So what we want to ask is, like the miners, how can I influence the things that I do have influence over? We always have some variance that we can control ourselves, and we should be aware of that. We're not helpless little corks on the sea of life. Next slide, please. When we get anxious, we tend to dwell. It rattles around in our brain through the day, through the night. It's not good. Rumination is common. What's worth noting is that the content of ruminative worries of people who have an anxiety disorder and those of non-anxious individuals are the same. Everybody has negative thoughts. What's different is the secondary cognition. And those are the thoughts like, I shouldn't think this. This is an awful thought. This is just terrible. Make it stop. And you know something, the more we tell ourselves to make it stop, the harder it gets. So what we want to do is disengage from these negative thoughts, these worries. Next slide. So what can be done? One is mindful acceptance. Accept it's just a thought. Challenge the thought. What's the evidence for it? And then desensitization. Practice ruminating and then solution-focused thinking. I say do it a couple times, do it 30 minutes a day, and you're training your brain then both to dwell on a problem, but also to develop solutions and then disengage. Very, very helpful. Next slide. And here's the example of this. This is the flying monkeys from The Wizard of Oz. And if you think about it, I don't know about you, when I was a kid, they scared the bejesus out of me. They're awful little guys, but look at them up close. Cute little guy. He's got little red lipstick there. There's Toto down on the side. He's actually not bad. And if you remember at the end of the movie, they don't actually kill anybody. They don't. They rough up the scarecrow, but they don't do anything. And at the end, it turns out they're good. At the end, when she throws the water on the witch, the monkeys say, "Hail Dorothy." So the notion is these thoughts, that's what these negative thoughts are. They're like wild monkeys flying around our heads. We can't stop them, so you might as well let them fly. It's just a thought. Next slide, please. So worrying is highly overrated. Dwelling on things, ruminating, it doesn't get us anywhere. What we want, and the more that you worry, or that your child worries, the more it impairs their ability to solve the problem in front of them. So we have two types of worries, productive and unproductive, solution-focused versus non-solution focused. And the notion then is when you have a worrying thought, develop an active action plan. And then for those things that there isn't an action plan, acceptance. And you say, this sounds like Buddhism. It is. Western rational science and Buddhism, Eastern philosophy, take us to the same place, which is that they allow us to disengage from the negative thought. Next slide. Who's the master of it? Stephen King. Think of the thoughts this guy has, from cars that drive over you, to Jack Nicholson going, to rabid dogs, to buckets of blood. And one person could say, oh my God, I've got to stop having these thoughts. It's a terrible thought. What Stephen King thinks is buckets of blood. That is a cool idea. I'll write a screenplay. I'll get $1 million advance. He takes these negative thoughts and uses them to his advantage. Next slide. So we want to evaluate our thoughts, and it's really pretty straightforward. These are the 3 central questions in cognitive behavioral therapy. So you have a thought, oh my God, I'm going to flunk out. Oh my God, I won't get into Dartmouth. Oh my God, coronavirus will go on forever and ruin my life. What's the evidence for and against it? Is there another way of looking at this? And then, so what? So what? Let's decatastrophize. We've been through this before. We'll get through it again. And so what? So what can be done? What's the solution? Simple, straightforward, practical. Next slide. Finally, flow with the current of life. If you've ever been, I'm a whitewater rafter. I love it. And you know, so in some ways we are whitewater rafting right now with coronavirus. We don't know when this rapid is going to end, but we need to be agile as we go through it. What does Lao Tzu, the Chinese philosopher, say? By letting it go, it all gets done. But when you try and try, the world is beyond winning. Let it go and float. Next slide. So what we have is the river. And this is what we hope our life is going to be like, floating on a beautiful stream in our kayak or in our raft. Next slide. But this is what we get. This is what life is like right now. And what we see is what they teach you if you're whitewater rafting. And for those of you who have whitewater rafted, you know what I'm talking about. They teach you if you're thrown from the raft, do not swim. You put your hand over your head, put your feet downstream, and be like a stick. Let the current carry you around the rocks, and it will drop you in an eddy at the bottom of the rapid. Be a stick, float with the current. Next slide. Finally, what do we want to do? What's the mindset we want to have for ourselves as we're going through coronavirus and all of these economic and medical and social upheaval? One is we want to be judicious. Use what we've known and what we've had from our past. Be open-minded, be empathic, be altruistic, be helpful to your fellow man, show compassion, reflect and show insight into the nature of the problem in our experience. Be tolerant of ambiguity, be tolerant of the foibles of your fellow man, and be aware of the larger issues that are at play as we cope with what is legitimately a significant stress. If we approach this, we live with what I call equanimity. We have a sense of balance and a sense of distance from the problems of life, such that we are not alarmed by them. Next slide. Which leads us, I call it the road to wisdom, to responding wisely, judiciously to the problems around us and the problems in our family. This is what we're trying to inculcate in our children. We want them to be wise, thoughtful, tolerant, empathic, compassionate, because these sorts of, we'll call them character traits for lack of a better term, are acquired over time and will help them, they'll help the child to be resilient, because this isn't the last time they're going to have a stress in their life. It's going to happen again. This will help them for years and years and years to come. Next slide. So this is the summary. Keep in mind that anxiety works for you. We want to think clearly, keep problems in perspective, problem solve rationally. Approach the things that you fear and master them. Don't run. Exposure, exposure, exposure. Be an active problem solver and engage in solution-focused thinking. You can practice this. But you want to balance this by active, mindful acceptance of the things you can't control. Take the long view, the larger view, and which allows you then to live with faith, hope, and equanimity, a sense of calm in the midst of a storm, which is what we are in right now. Next slide. So here's some resources for you and from everything from the federal government to Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapy. At the bottom, you can see there's our website, Child Mind. Boy, it is a good website. You're going to find so much useful information there. Next slide. That's what I hope for you, is that you'll be able to keep calm and carry on. We're all going to get through this. I know that's trite. Everybody says it on every newscast now, but it is true. That's what we want. Next slide. Which gives us happy kids. Next slide. And happy parents. Next slide. There's the little book. Take a look. You might like it. Next slide. And a thank you from me and from all of us. And I mean this sincerely, the bottom of the slide. We're at the Child Mind Institute. We are here to help. You can call us. You can there's my email address. And I'll tell you, that email comes straight to me. Send me a note. I'm happy to help. We're happy to help. And there you go. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. We really appreciate that. And I love how you were able to both soothe us and educate us at the same time. Obviously, parents are worried. They know their children are worried, and you've given us a lot of tools to help both with our own worry and anxiety and our kids. So thank you for that. Really lovely. Mm-hmm. All right, so those of you who are with us If you have any questions for Mark, we have a few minutes, and at the bottom of your screen, you will see an icon, a Zoom icon at the bottom of the screen that's labeled Q&A. If you have any questions, please feel free to type questions in there. I'm going to get us started with a few that we've had from parents come in over the last few weeks, so let's get going. Here's one, Mark, that I know everybody is thinking about, and I'll bet those of you with kids at home have experienced it. Since the shelter-in-place orders, my teenager seems more moody than usual. She gets easily frustrated and irritated with me and her siblings. Should I be worried about her behavior?
The answer to that is perhaps. And I know that's an ambiguous answer, but perhaps. The question really becomes one of how severe. And is it impairing them in terms of their mood? I've had some youngsters who I've seen who've gotten thoughts of death and suicide. When you start to hear that, discouraged about their future, when it becomes clinically severe or it goes on and on and on, it's not just a passing little few minutes, take it seriously. What I can suggest is a lot of kids, frankly, there's two things that are playing out that I see in a lot of youngsters. One of them is that they're worried about their grades and their academic performance. And what's this going to mean for my getting into college? They need to relax. Everybody's going to get into college. Everybody's going to have a good future. Everybody's going through the same thing. I know here in the Bay Area where a lot of school districts are going to pass-fail, pass-fail is actually potentiating anxiety. Let's just step back and look at it together. That's number one. But if you think about it with teenagers and children, their routines have been really disrupted. And particularly with teenagers, where a lot of what's being a teenager is about being out and away from your parents and being independent and being with your peer group. It's about individuation from the family. Here, it's being turned on its head and they're back with the family 24/7. This is not what adolescence is supposed to be about. So what I suggest is let's put some of the normative experience of adolescence back into their life, or childhood back into their life. And for particularly when they're feeling bored and sort of down, four things I look for. It comes under the rubric of behavioral activation. Activities that give you fun. Let's make a fun list of things that you could do that would be entertaining. Let's watch, every night we're going to watch one of the top 100 funniest movies of all time. We're going to play, I don't know, Stratego again. We haven't played that. Make a puzzle. I don't care. I had a kid, you can't make this stuff up, a youngster who I was working with the other week. He went out and got a 2x4 and made a slide guitar out of his 2x4. It cost him under $20. And I got to tell you, he was playing it. It was screaming. It sounded like something from the bayou in Louisiana. Let's do something exciting and fun and new. That fun activities. Things that give you a sense of accomplishment or achievement. That could be, most people think of academic, but it doesn't have to be. But something where you feel like I've really pushed myself and I've developed a skill. I've learned cooking. I've learned to speak Chinese. I've taken on something. Social engagement. Call up some friends who you haven't seen since the first grade. You can make friends I have patients who have friends all around the world on Facebook, not on Facebook, on FaceTime. So social engagement as best you can, even though you're in quarantine right now, so to speak. And finally, what I call value-laden behavior, volunteering, doing something for others. And you can make a list of those things. But if you do those 4 lists and do one from each domain every day, it's not going to make coronavirus go away, but it will lead you to have a good day and feel better about yourself and your life. So it's all in how we engineer our lives that leads us to feel fulfilled and happy and worthwhile. And we can do that whether we're in a house or out in the community. Okay, so good question.
All right, thank you. Speaking of coping behaviors, Mark, here's one. What kind of breathing exercises do you recommend to kids or their parents for anxiety?
Breathing exercises?
Yes, breathing exercises.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I'm a big advocate of sort of diaphragmatic breathing. And so that's breathing in low from your stomach. And then, so you fill your lungs slowly. And then here's what I would say is, everybody says take a deep breath. But if you do that, you're going to raise your blood oxygen content a touch too high. You don't want to hyperoxygenate. You don't want to hyperventilate. So you breathe in slowly. Hold it for 7-8 seconds. So you count. And then breathe out slowly as if you're blowing on a soup spoon. Now, if you think about it, what's happening is we're not only breathing in slowly in a controlled manner, but we're slowly raising blood carbon dioxide level. And by the counting, we are putting our attention out away from whatever the anxiety-laden thought is and onto the number. It really works. You do that once or twice, anxiety just sort of drops away. Works nicely. So I'm a big advocate of I don't know what we want to call it, a controlled breathing.
Okay, thank you.
Don't hyperventilate.
All right, here's a question that I bet is on everybody's mind, especially those of us who have kids at home.
Mm-hmm.
One positive thing that I've seen with teens at home is you don't have to worry so much about drug, sex, curfew, hopefully, if your teens are staying in the house.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm worried about what might happen when the floodgates open. Will they go wild when they're unleashed? And will we have to make up for lost time? Any tips on preparing for this eventual outcome?
I'm not sure there's going to be a floodgate that gets released. I think what you're going to find is that many youngsters are going to feel anxious and stressed and depressed when they get out. I was talking to one teenager about this, and I said, if you could have any wish at all right now, when you get done with COVID-19, what would be the thing you do? And he goes, I want to hang out at the mall. And I was like, that's it? And he goes, yeah, I just want to sit with my friends. Do you want to do anything? And he goes, no, I just want to be with my friends. I suspect what people are going to do is go back to their normal patterns of behavior. I don't think there's going to be an explosion of egregious behavior when kids are set free. I think as good parents, we'll want to monitor that. Invite when my wife and our daughter is now in her 20s, but when my wife and I had a teenager, we remember, you might remember this when you all were kids, we called it the Kool-Aid house. We had the Kool-Aid house where all the kids wanted to hang out. And so we had, ping pong tables and dartboards and loud music, and all the kids wanted to hang out at our house. And what they didn't realize is that mom and I were watching them all the time. And so we had, how would you put it? Our thumb was on the pulse, even though they were having a blast. And it worked out really well. So my suggestion would be, as parents, keep your thumb on the pulse as, you let them out.
All right, this is a question that may be something that you'll need to take up offline with a parent, but there's a question embedded in here. So let me see if I can handle it. So this is a parent who's talking about their son who feels frustrated by his general lack of motivation and excitement. He feels like he has low expectations of himself and he really can't advocate for what he wants. Not sure whether these are deep-seated problems, perhaps exacerbated by the quarantine. Is this something that I should be talking about with a professional?
Perhaps. And the question about the professional is it a part of a larger depressive disorder? Does he feel down, depressed, sad, blue more than 50% of the time for 2 weeks or more? Is he irritable and edgy more than 50% of the time? Changes in sleep, changes in appetite, thoughts of death and suicide, troubles with concentration and memory. If you see that cluster of depressive symptoms around it, this may be a symptom of a depressive condition which you would want to treat seriously, take it seriously. However, there's lots of teenagers who are unclear of what they want to do and what they want to be. They have trouble with that sort of image of the future, of moving out of childhood when your life and your world is basically guided by your parents and the larger institutions around you like school, and off into being the creator of your own world. That's why kids, how would you put it, hate the R word, responsibility. They want the freedom, but they don't want to take responsibility for directing their own lives. They don't know where to go. They're teenagers. This ability to identify what I want to be, what I want to do that's going to be engaging to me, what my values are, what my relationships are going to be like as an adult. These are the tasks of adolescence. And sometimes for kids, for teenagers, it can be difficult to get the answers to those questions, and they feel they're floundering. So really then coming back to the question, this lack of motivation, the question I have is, where is it coming from? Is this part of a lack of image of the sense of the future, what I call the positive self or the possible self, what I want to be and be like as a person that's better than I am now? they don't have that yet, they need it? Or is it coming from depression and something's really is off? And so they've lost the ability to see a positive future for themselves. So we need to think about what's the origin of this, what's driving it, and then we can come up with a solution.
Okay, fair enough. Good advice. Thank you, Mark. And again, these slides and this video will be available, and in them is a lot of contact information, both for Mark himself, for Dr. Reinecke, and the Child Mind Institute. So be sure to look at that if you have questions that you'd like to refer to him or the agency. All right, Mark, here's a tricky one, and I'll bet a lot of people are feeling this, no matter what age their child is. This parent says, my kids are showing a lot of fear around the coronavirus. They ask, will I get sick? Will you get sick? What happens if mommy and daddy die? How can I help them feel okay when we don't know what the future will bring?
My suggestion would be take the slides that I just shared. You're sounding like my wife in the car. Oh my God, what are we going to do? You don't want to be just offering, well, it really depends on the developmental age of your child. Is this a young child? You sound like a young child from the questions. Is mommy and daddy going to die? That's what you'd hear from a preschooler or a young school age child, not a teenager. But the answers that you give depend upon the developmental level of your child and what they can handle. For young children, just offer reassurance, and direct their head. I would ask, tell me what you're thinking and where you got this idea from. What led you to think that we could die? Well, people are dying all around. That is true. But that's the tricky thing, isn't it? People die, but that's not likely here, just not likely. And so you can offer some reassurance for that. With a teenager, you can have a frank discussion about why this is a stressful situation, and it's bringing up issues of mortality. People are passing away, particularly older folks. The elderly. It's not likely to happen here. It's certainly not likely to happen to you. The number of individuals, teens and younger, who have died of this are vanishingly small. This is where having that sort of, let's not magnify it, let's have a sense of perspective. Let's keep the numbers actually in mind. And we talked about there's 50,000 Americans have died. That's actually kind of equivalent with the rate for the flu each year. There are differences, of course, in the pattern, but let's not magnify how severe this is. It's serious, but we want to have a sense of perspective about it all. We also want to keep in mind, we're talking about what can we influence? There are things that we can do to influence this. We can stay indoors. Let's not go outside and go shopping this afternoon or go to a mall. Let's wash our hands and use hand sanitizer. Let's wear a mask. I'll show you something. Where have I got it? Where is my mask? Somewhere around here I had one. My wife made me a mask, a nice Stanford mask out of a t-shirt. Let's wear masks, and we'll make it something that you can have a sense of control over. So those things, sense of perspective, sense of influence, and then relaxation and distraction. Those are the tools of the trade for managing anxiety in children. Now, keep in mind also, just as a final thought, your child will model how you react. They call it social referencing. If in an ambiguous situation, if a parent is anxious and agitated and frantic, a child sees that and will internalize it. In turn, if you're calm, you've got it together, you're relaxed, you've got a sense of perspective, your child will monitor and perceive that as well. Okay.
All right, thank you. So last question, Mark, here. This one again is something that may be more directed towards you and Child Mind Institute, but here's a parent going through a messy divorce with children who are 7 and 10. She says, I feel alienated and demonized. I tell them I love them and I'm proud and I want to spend as much time with them as I can. Yet, what should be my focus when we do have time together and the dust settles down?
Well, this is an interesting question, and it's actually a very good question, because here what we have is the stress in the outside world and coronavirus and all these anxieties that are being imposed on your children and your family. And at the same time, the pressures that are coming from the divorce, the separation and the divorce. It's hard to know in a specific situation, so I'll just talk in global terms. But one of the things with children, and particularly with school-age children like you have, to think about is security. And we talk about secure attachments and helping our children to feel secure in the world so that they don't feel vulnerable. And this is research that goes back to John Bowlby and Mary Main and Mary Ainsworth and all of the attachment literature. And if you Google it, it'll show up. Look up attachment security. But there's three components to attachment security. What do we need to do to have a child who feels secure in their world? One is you want to be, as a parent, you want to be reliable. And I mean reliable in the statistical sense, predictable. They know how you're going to behave and you're not erratic. You are stable and predictable. Second is responsive, that they know that you've got their back. When they send out a message that they are feeling distressed, they're upset, they're emotionally concerned, they're crying, they're whatever, that you've got their back and you are there to protect them, that you're there to help them solve their problem. You've got their back. And the third is emotional availability and what I call nurturant attitude. Sort of, you want to be positive, loving, and affectionate towards them. Create a positive tone in the home, as opposed to critical, anxious, chaotic, or even punitive. We don't want to be getting angry and frustrated with them. So if you do those three things, reliable, responsive, and then nurturant and affectionate, that creates a really positive tone in the home, which can help to insulate them and make them feel secure in the face of all of these things that are swirling around them. I think that your stance, I want to have them feel loved and protected by me when they're with me, that is spot on. That's exactly what we want to do. It's exactly what we want to do. But you want to help them to be sure, separations and divorces can get contentious. And for a child, I don't know if that's a worst case scenario, but it's certainly in the top 5, is a family and that supportive family breaking apart. So this is those anxieties and the coronavirus anxieties being impinging at the same time, it's troubling. So you're going to have to work then to create that sort of supportive, loving, predictable environment at home. Okay?
All right, thank you, Mark. So to all of you who are listening today, I want to say thank you so much for joining us. First of all, as we say, you, the parents, are the experts in your own children. Here at the Parent Education Series, we strive to give you information that will help you communicate with your kids. So please today, as your homework, since we're in school, think about one thing that Mark said today that you can share with your kids. What message did you take away that really can be helpful? He's given you lots of wonderful tools and things to think about. I know I feel a lot less anxious and stressed. And when I was 2, my family dubbed me the family worrier. So I understand it. Again, thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Reinecke, and everybody from Child Mind Institute. So take care, stay well, and I hope to see you on Thursday. Thank you and goodbye.